Thank you very much, Dr. Gifts, and thank you, Mr. Bousquet, for inviting me. Let me also express my thanks to the St. Lucia National Reparations Committee and the Center for Reparation Research at the UWI for inviting me to speak at this forum. I know that the theme today is Deceptive Asian Indentureship with a focus on resistance and the abolition of contract labor. And of course, I've been asked to look at that theme through the lens of the Indian perspective. So essentially what I'm going to do today is an examination of the Indian indenture system. I would be looking at circumstances leading to the system. I'll be looking a bit on the actual system itself, and then also at what happened after the system was terminated. So we'll get straight into it, Indian indenture in the Caribbean. I would like to give a bit of context before I get into the actual system, essentially what was happening prior to the arrival of the Indians in the Caribbean. First of all, I'll give you a Caribbean context, and a bit later on, we will talk about the Indian context. So some of what I'm going to say now in terms of the Caribbean context, I'm sure that you students would be aware of it. So there was the situation of the abolition of African enslavement by 1834. And of course, post-abolition, we know that, the former enslaved Africans, they, were now requesting, and rightfully so, there were demands for better wages, better working conditions, and so forth. Now, what they weren't aware of was the fact that the colonial authorities, British colonialism, had already set certain things in place. And one of those things that the British had already set in place was a very huge available labor force in India. And we'll talk about how that process worked in a little while. So by 1834, the British already had a ready waiting labor force in India. But, the Africans did not know, the former enslaved individuals, they did not know. So what the British had, they had bargaining power. And of course, the former enslaved did not see this coming at all, because they thought now, in their heads, they were the ones to provide the labor, the only ones to provide the labor at that point. So they had the bargaining power, but they didn't know that there was another source. So the Indians now, provided a chip for colonialism. So instead of giving in to demands for better wages and working conditions, the British decided now to draw on that other source of labor that they had already established in India. And hence, the Indians were brought because of this reason. Especially for students, I know there is this running view that Indians were brought to fill a gap in labor in the Caribbean, but there was no gap in labor. There was a workforce. However, the British preferred, it was more economical for them to bring the Indians as indentured laborers than to increase wages for the former African enslaved individuals, okay? So the Indians were brought, and neither the Indians nor the Africans were the wiser. The Indians knew nothing of the context that they were coming into. And the Africans, they were totally, taken by surprise with this new group of individuals to provide labor. So one can easily understand that right away throughout the Caribbean, Indians were seen as economic competition by the Africans, because in their minds, if these people didn't come, we would have had more bargaining power, or these people came and literally took away our bread and butter, so to speak. Okay, so Indians were seen as competitions. The Indians themselves now, new environment, totally new and alien in so many ways, physical, cultural, geographic differences. So of course, over time, seeing that there was a negative response by the Africans towards them, they responded likewise, in addition to the fact that they were total strangers in the area. So this, they responded with, indifference, suspicion, fear of the unknown, scorn of the unknown sometimes, okay? It's general differences. But what my spin on this whole thing, and of course this is just my perspective, is that the long-standing racial tension that we continue to experience in the Caribbean is as a result of, how colonialism chose to deal with this situation post African enslavement. They chose to bring the Indians as competition rather than provide better wages and so forth. And of course, they just did it, unknown to either side. So that is just my perspective that, this racial undercurrent that we seem to have in many areas of the Caribbean, it is rooted in this particular issue. Okay, so that is just the Caribbean context. So between 1838 and 1917, you had approximately, and I say approximate because, people are still researching their, and they, even up to now, people come up, they come across new documents and so forth that would change numbers and so on slightly. So I will use approximation. So approximately 500,000 Indians were brought to the Caribbean under the scheme of Indian indenture. And as you can see from the table, the largest number would have gone to British Guyana, then to Trinidad, and then to Guadeloupe. Very smaller numbers now to Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Dutch Guyana, Suriname, then Martinique, around 25,000, French Guyana, close to 19,000, and then very small numbers going to St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent, around 4,300, 3,200, 2,400 respectively. Okay, so the table breaks down the distribution of Indians to the Caribbean. And right away, with the huge difference in numbers to British Guyana and Trinidad, we can right away understand why the current dynamics of Indians in Guyana and Trinidad would be different from, let's say, the group from Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Dutch Guyana, Suriname, Martinique, and then very small numbers in St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent. So the numbers, and that's not just the only factor, but the numbers would be a factor in what happened after indenture with Indians in the various locations in the Caribbean. Okay. Moving on a bit now to this map of India, and it shows you a bit of the areas from where the indentured laborers were drawn. Most of the indentured laborers were drawn from the what the states called Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, northern provinces, some also from Bengal, and a small proportion from southern parts of India. So currently in the Caribbean, the Indians who are here are descendants of these regions, essentially the northern regions of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And of course, by extension, what is seen as Indian culture in the Caribbean will be reflective of this, because India is a vast subcontinent, not just in size physically, but it is culturally, in terms of culture, religion, it is very diverse. So what we have in the Caribbean with Indians is a North Indian, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, colloquially referred to as Bhojpuri or Bihari culture in the Caribbean, with sprinklings of, influences from South India. Then of those immigrants who came, you had the bulk, of course, of the immigrants being males, because the focus was on extraction of labor. Of course, females would come. You had, throughout the period of indenture, a very, very skewed ratio between males and females. Sometimes it was as bad as 5 males to 1 female on a ship, on any one shipment. They did attempt to address this issue. However, the best it ever got was 2 to 1. 2 females to 1 male. And of course, that would lead to problems later on. So emphasis was on extraction of able-bodied males between the ages of 20 to 30 years of age. That's the age that you would be able to secure extract most labor from. Okay, so a preponderance of males over females and emphasis on the age group 20 to 30 years. This slide attempts to show you a bit about religion of the religious makeup of the migrants. Of course, the bulk may be about 80 to 85%, depending on the location, whether Trinidad, St. Vincent, St. Lucia. The bulk of the immigrants would be Hindus. Between 14 to, let's say, 16 or 17% would be Muslims. And there was a very minuscule, let's say, Christian or other, we'll put it as other, including Christians, Jains, Buddhists, and so on, composition. So the bulk of the migrants, of course, they belong to the Hindu religion, and the table sort of breaks it down for you a bit in terms of caste. Most of the laborers who came were from the lower caste of India. The agricultural caste also belonged to the lower caste, the two lowest castes. And then what was the Brahmin caste, which is the highest, or we can call it the priestly caste also. But for your knowledge, the bulk of the laborers came from the laboring lower classes of India. Now, this is very important. Let's look at some of the push factors in India. But before I get into the push factors, there is a question or an issue that always arises. Actually, there are two. One, there is a question of was indentured labor, or was the system of indenture another form of slavery? Okay, that's, and we can go into the details, but my short answer would be no, it wasn't, but it was a form of unfreedom. Okay, it was not a form of slavery, but there were various shades and markers of unfreedom in the system. And the second issue is that of voluntariness. How voluntary was the system? Okay, and the general idea is that the Indians, well, it wasn't slavery, so the Indians, they came willingly. No, it wasn't slavery, but the simply to say that they came willingly is not the absolute truth. To answer this, we need to understand the Indian context. Okay, now and that's why I'm going to look at the push factors a bit in India. What was happening in India around the time that Indian indentureship was initiated? Now, the British had been in India for a very long time, but they had become engaged in the politics of India, putting it bluntly, engaging in colonizing India from as early as 1757, various strategies and so on. Yeah. So by the time you got to, let's say, the 1830s in India, the very large portion, most of India was under British rule. There were certain small pockets that were still independent, but nevertheless, most of India was under British rule. So the British had about 2 centuries to really wreak havoc on the economic and social life of India. And these are some points that I have itemized to tell you what they were doing. They had commercialized agriculture. They were there for commercial purposes initially. So very quickly, as they gained political control of India, they started to use agricultural space, lands and so on that was previously geared towards production of food for India to feed itself. They started to use those agricultural spaces for non-food crop production. They were, for example, the British were interested in trading with the Chinese, and the Chinese just weren't interested in European goods. What the Chinese wanted was opium. So the British grew in India, they grew poppy to create the opium, which they would then sell to China for Chinese spices and so forth, and silks. Okay, they grew, of course, so poppy was planted. You had, a lot of emphasis on sugarcane, on indigo, non-food crops. Yeah. So of course now commercialization of agriculture would lead to a decline in food production. And in addition to producing less food, so now the economy was not able to sustain itself in terms of feeding itself. What was produced, there were times when that small amount even was exported to various parts of Europe, especially during the 2 World War periods. The British took the food from India and exported it to their troops fighting during those 2 world wars. And of course, the Indians were left to starve. Then, of course, in addition to the commercialization of agriculture, there was the mass destruction of local industries. When the British came into India, they found very vibrant industries. India was one of the largest producers of raw cotton and finished cotton products to the world. Very, very big producer and supplier of silks also. But the British, and as colonialism would want to do, its colonies must be a provider of raw material, not finished products. So they employed various strategies and destroyed these industries in India. Okay. So by the time you got to the 1830s, there was mass destruction of local industries. And remember, when this happens, people are being rendered jobless. People who were working in these industries were now they had no jobs, okay? People who were working in agriculture, many of them, they had no jobs anymore because the British would not employ them. You know, it wasn't certain that the British would employ them in this new commercialization process. Also, the British employed various land taxation policies and trade policies. Just one point I want to make about the destruction of industries before I move on. I mean, they used extreme measures to the point that sometimes they would cut off the thumbs of spinners of cotton so that these people, you know, they could not, if they found somebody who was supplying cotton locally in the Indian context as opposed to the British, they would cut off their thumbs so they could not spin. So there was a lot of brutality in the whole situation. In terms of land taxation and trade policies, the British doctored and they engineered various land taxation and trade policies towards their benefit, and that worked towards the detriment of the Indian economy. For example, before the British came to India, land was not private property, but they made it private property so that now land could be appropriated by the British from the Indians and sold as private property. So one of the land taxation schemes that they implemented, and many followed along similar trends, they would tell the Indians, you know, so when the British got control of a particular place politically, everyone had to pay the taxes to the British. And so this was the point. The taxation was the point that the British would manipulate. So they would tell the Indian, would raise the tax, first of all, sometimes twice the amount, and regardless of whether they could pay it or not. And then they would tell the Indians, if you could not pay your taxes by a particular day, there was one law called the Sunset Law. If you could not pay your taxes by a particular day at sunset, your lands would now go to the British, as you know, because of your failure to pay. And that happened. Many taxations were put in place because of that. So Indians lost their lands, they lost their means of livelihood, and of course now they were left with nothing. And think all the points I'm looking at, they point towards the creation of a landless labor market. You had the labor, but there was nowhere for the Indians to apply that labor because they had no land. So they could only work for the British. Trade policies were similar. Indian goods going out of India to Europe were expected to pay higher, much higher taxes than British goods coming into India. So of course that destroyed in Indian industries and produce further. Then, of course, the Indian society was structured in such a way that you would have entire villages, you know, revolving around a particular skill or particular activity. So for example, you might have entire villages who are weavers. You might have entire villages who are producing cotton. You might have entire villages who are blacksmiths, okay? And of course, most people in agriculture in some form. So when, you know, one particular industry, let's say cotton industry, was affected, it would impact on entire villages, okay? Various sizes of villages. So in this way, the social fabric, not just the economic fabric, but the social fabric was being destroyed, because if an entire village of weavers would be now displaced, they would have to leave that place and now go elsewhere in search of work. Okay, so it was sort of a domino effect, all intertwined, where British economic and trade policies and land taxation policies all worked together towards the creation of a landless labor force. All right, a huge, impoverished, landless labor force. And in addition to this, the British continued to, you know, during the British period, there was a substantial increase in famines. And a lot of these famines were actually creations of the British. One British official, in fact, shamelessly said that if you wanted labor, just create a famine in an area. And they would do that. So they created these famines so that at least once in 2 years, there would be widespread famine. So what they did is that there was a situation where people would basically do anything for a meal. There were these famine camps set up throughout India, and wherever the British wanted physical labor to build bridges or whatever else, the Indians would come and they would tell them, okay, 1 day's work and you would be paid with one meal. That was your wages for the day, a meal, and it was no substantial meal. Okay, so bottom line, a number of factors came into play in India, all created by the British, so that by the time you got to 1838, there was already existent, created by the British, a huge impoverished labor force that would do practically anything, leave India included, to, to make a living, to feed themselves, to stay alive. Okay? And this is just one image of the impoverishment that was taking place in India. I mean, you can see they're practically skeletal, these individuals. Okay? So those were the push factors in India that, you know, would create that labor force that the British would draw on from 1838 to replace, so to speak, the former African enslaved, the labor that was provided there. And instead of giving these former African enslaved that bargaining power, they now had this bargaining power in the form of the Indians. So let's move on a bit now into recruitment. And this also, now the points I looked at, the push factors, if you have to consider the question of voluntariness of the system, you have to look at all these points. And you also have to remember a very key point, that prior to colonialism in India, Indians were not prone to migrating out of India, you know, for permanently. The wave around 1200 AD or so, you did have a wave of what we now know as gypsies moving out of India. That was the only wave. Okay, but apart from that, Indians were not prone to leaving India, you know, permanently. And then also, to answer this question of voluntariness or not, we have to look at the whole recruitment process. I will say from at the outset that, let's say, between the 1830s to about the 1870s, many of the Indians who were recruited really weren't sure about the whole system, where they were going and so forth. After the 1870s, the system became more stable. And of course, by then people had gotten word of what the system was really about. So, but prior to the 1870s, a lot of the Indians who embarked on the ships, they weren't very sure about what was happening. Many stories were given to them. There were those who were outrightly kidnapped, especially women, so they were physically kidnapped. There were those men and women who, you know, various lies and stories were painted for them. Sometimes they would tell them, the government needs your work, and that was a norm in India for the government to request or demand free labor from Indians. So they would tell them that the government needs your labor in Calcutta. To get to Calcutta, you have to make a long journey by foot. You also have to cross rivers. So it wasn't odd that they would embark on a boat and go across a large expanse of land, of water. If you stand on one bank of a river in India, like the Ganges, you can't see the other side. And you would take, you know, with those slow moving ships, you would take quite a long time to get to the other side. So they would this is one of the stories, they would tell them, sometimes they would tell them, you know, okay, you're going to a place called Trinidad, you know, for Trinidad, or Sri Ram for Suriname, you know, because Trinidad means sugar, Chini means sugar. And they paint stories of easy work. You are going to sift sugar, nothing about planting and hard work. You are just going to sift sugar, easy money, you know, and then you will come back. Or they might look at an individual, let's say, who is a potter, and they will tell this individual that there is a demand for your skill in this particular place. And if you go, you would make money. Yeah. So everybody, think of a population that's starving, that has nothing and nowhere to channel their labor, and now they are being presented with these stories of opportunities. So a lot of them would actually, you know, in our local parlance, would be fooled into embarking on these ships. Sometimes when they embarked on the ships and they realized, wait, it's about 2 or 3 days and we're not seeing any land, you know, then it would dawn on them that they've left India, or something to that sort, or then they would be told that they would have left India. And a few of them even jumped overboard, attempting to swim back to India, but of course they died in the process. Okay, so before the 1870s, there was a lot of, you know, the whole system was very vague. And again, as I said, if you were to look at, try to consider the issue of voluntariness, you have to consider this issue also. How were the Indians recruited? There was a lot of kidnapping, and the reasons for migrating given to these individuals were very, very vague. There were also stories documented, not just stories made up, but official documents giving accounts of people being kidnapped and then being spotted by family members or friends on the trains taking them to Calcutta. Some of them were actually saved. There was this man who saw his wife, and he happened to be passing at the station, looked into the train and saw his wife there, and then she was able to tell him what was going on, and he got the police to get her off and so forth. And some people weren't lucky. Okay, so there was a lot of shadiness surrounding the recruitment of the Indians before the 1870s. And this chart that I have there just basically tells you of the process. All right, the person who actually recruited was someone known as the Arkatia or recruiter. He was often a very shady character, sometimes one who's been in jail. He would be the one employed to make up these stories or to even kidnap these individuals. All right. Then each Arkatia would have a quota to recruit. When he has his quota, he would now take them to the licensed recruiter at a sub-depot. There were many sub-depots throughout India, and he would be paid. The licensed recruiter would then wait for his quota, which would be a large number, maybe about 100 or so. And when he has his quota from his various, Arkatias or recruiters, then he would now collect everybody and take them on that journey to the Calcutta depot, where they would wait for the ship. The journey on foot sometimes would be very, very long, weeks sometimes. And then, of course, when the railway was introduced in India, it would be shorter, maybe a day or two. Okay. Now, sometimes, when people are being kept in the depot was like a prison. Those sub-depots, and of course, the Calcutta depot, they were like prisons. Once you got in, you could not get out. All right. There were security guards, one door that was heavily guarded. At the Calcutta depot, sometimes they would have, if there was a ship, they would go right away. And then sometimes they would have to wait for a while. At the depot now, before they embarked on the ship, and this was another part of the shadiness of the process in the early stages, the Indians would have to pass certain medical tests, and they had to be deemed fit to endure the journey, not for labor, but to endure the journey. So there was supposed to be a surgeon superintendent, but oftentimes, this didn't work as efficiently as it should. Sometimes, they would, if there was an Indian who didn't want to go, they would give the surgeon superintendent this particular person's name, but they would send a more willing person to be interviewed or to be examined. If there was an ill Indian, they would send a healthier one in his name to be examined. So a lot of, as I said, shadiness. Also, in terms of the contracts, right there and then, the Indians were supposed to sign the contracts. Of course, most of these migrants could not read. The contracts were done in 3 languages, Hindi, Arabic, and English, but they could read none of those 3. So they would, what would happen is that you would have the surgeon superintendent, and he would have an intermediary, usually an educated Indian, so to speak, and that person would be acting as translator. So his job would be to ask, to translate, so to speak, the contract for the Indians and ask the Indians if they agreed. And usually he would not tell the Indians what would be in the contract, because then they would know that they were leaving India. All right. So he would, that translator, that go-between, would tell the Indians whatever he felt they wanted to hear. And then they would put their thumbprint on the contracts. And then the translator would tell the surgeon superintendent, yes, the person has agreed to the contract. Okay, so that also was, that is something that needs to be considered when we look at the issue of voluntariness. How many of the Indians actually knew where they were going? How real was the system, or how much of a veneer was the system that was put in place to deal with indentureship, even the contracts? We'll talk about the contracts later. So once they got on the ship, regardless of whatever means, whether willingly, whether not so willingly, the surgeon superintendent, there was an individual on the ship also who was supposed to take care of them. And then when they landed, wherever in the Caribbean, the individual who was in charge of them was an individual known as a protector of immigrants. Each colony had a protector of immigrants, or the office of the protector of immigrants. And that person, that protector of immigrants, would now decide which immigrant is going to which estate. So he would now send them to the various estates. This is a picture of one of the ships, Fatal Razak. There were many ships, and of course, the journey sometimes from India to the Caribbean would last 3 months. Sometimes, depending on the weather, the speed of the ship, there were one or two that lasted one actually that lasted up to 6 months, but usually it would be about 3 months. You on board the ship, it was very cramped. But they did attempt every day to keep the Indians on deck. They were fed 2 meals per day. If the weather was bad, they had to stay below deck and so forth. On the ship, a lot of atrocities took place, especially with regard to women or young girls even. You read books like Maharani's Misery, Coolitude, and so forth. Coolie Woman, you would have stories of young girls, and I mean sometimes below the age of 10, who would be raped, and enticed by these sailors and these British officials, in return for food. Sometimes basic as food, promising them maybe more food or a few more biscuits and so forth. And they would rape these women, or with older women. It was supposed to be what you call consensual, but how consensual was it really if you are doing it for survival? Okay, but there were cases of young girls actually being raped, no promises of anything, actually being raped. So that occurred on the ships also. This is a shot of Indians arriving in Jamaica. So usually the large ships, and you can see it in the background, the large ships would be anchored a bit way off. They couldn't enter the harbor. And then you'd have these smaller boats would go and collect the Indians. In some cases, you had Indians were quarantined. Well, most cases they were quarantined. In Trinidad, for example, the Nelson Island, a separate island, was used for quarantine for the individuals. And in other islands, you had certain quarters that were used to quarantine the Indians before they were now assigned to various plantations. This here it's not very clear because of the scan, but it's an emigration pass. This is what the individuals would be filled out for each immigrant, okay? And there were categories like the person's name, the person's father's name, their age, their caste, the name of the district that they came from, and so forth. Now these you can say, and then you might say, well, okay, there was something, there were documents, but there was no care was really taken to actually fill these out. So sometimes, for example, father's name in India, no, but the concept of surname did not exist. So what would happen in order to fit the Indians into this colonial context, what the British would do when the Indians came, they would use the person's name as what we would call their first name, and then they would just automatically take the father's name and append it as the person's surname. Sometimes for caste, they didn't get it right. Now, caste is a Hindu system. So if there were Muslim immigrants, they would put, under caste, they would put Muslim or Musliman. And I've seen also in a registration of births form, even for the British, under caste, they put British. It borders on the ridiculous. But the point is, there was no attempt to differentiate, okay? So this is just by the way information. Right, so this is a picture of one of the quarantine spots on Nelson Island in Trinidad. The contract, let's move on a bit. So the contract, as I told you, it was written in 3 languages, English, Hindi, and Arabic, none of which Indians could read. The contract had stated in certain conditions, all right, not all of them. You have some, you had the length and terms of indenture in these contracts. Usually, well, the length kept changing of indenture. So the indenture, the laborer might go for 2 years first, and then additional 3 years, then it shifted to 3 years for a while, then 2 years. So it kept changing. Then the contracts, especially for the Caribbean, they stipulated the idea of a return passage. So you, first of all, at the end of the day, had to complete 5 years labor, indentured labor. And then if you wanted to qualify for this return passage back to India, you couldn't get it right away. You had to re-indenture yourself for another 5 years, okay? Or if you wanted to go back before, then you had to pay your way. All right, so you only can get that return passage if you've completed 10 years, that's further 5 years. In terms of payment, the contract stipulated 25 cents per adult able-bodied male and 16 cents per female. Of course, the point to note is that more often than not, almost never did this 25 cents, was this 25 cents given to males. Wages were always lower than stipulated in the contracts. All right, we'll talk about wages in a while. The contract also stipulated a 45-hour work week, 6 days per week. But usually, most of the times, the Indians had to do 9 hours work. And then sometimes, instead of working in terms of days or hours, they were given tasks to perform. So sometimes these tasks would be extended or expanded so that, it would be more profitable for the British to use task work at certain times where more was done for less pay. That was always the emphasis, less wages, whatever to be done so that the Indians would be paid less. Okay, but note, so these were the main points that were stipulated in the contract. All right, and you can see right away, it's not everything. It did not say anything about conditions on the estate. Sometimes the contract would say that the Indians were to get rations in terms of food and so forth, but not all the times. All right, but specific conditions on the estates were not stipulated in the contract. Now, let's go a little bit into what actually happened on the estates. Now, as I said before, the Indians had to deal with a period of quarantine when they landed in the various colonies. I mentioned the contract. There was a long contract, and it was to be completed with the same employer, whether it was 2 years or 3 years. There were penal sanctions for breaches of the contract. So if you broke the contract, you could be charged, you could be jailed, and it definitely did happen. Okay. In Trinidad, Indians were granted land for just over a period of 10 years in lieu of, instead of the return passage. So because over time, the British realized, not just in Trinidad, but elsewhere, that, it might be more feasible, we have enough labor, we don't need to bring more in. So let us let us offer the Indians the option to stay. And how do we make it attractive? We offer them land, 10 acres of land, and later on 5 acres of land, if they were to stay and not return to India. So it was a payoff. Either you return with your grant or give up the grant for 10 acres of land or 5 acres of land and stay in Trinidad. So most of the Indians in Trinidad, over 90%, prefer the land, because at the end of the day, this was something in their eyes that was sure. If they were to return to India, they weren't sure what was going to happen. So that was in Trinidad. Then on the estates, when the Indians had completed their period of indenture, all right, and if they chose to stay wherever in the Caribbean, they had to have with them at all time, and I mean on their physical persons, a certificate of industrial residence, something that was commonly referred to as their freedom paper. And if an Indian was found outside of an estate without this paper, they would be thrown in jail. And the bottom line is, the Indian's word did not suffice. An Indian could not simply say, I have completed my period of indenture, I'm no longer indentured. That didn't suffice. They needed to see the freedom paper. If it's not there, you go to jail. All right? Well, we spoke about that point. Indians could re-indenture themselves, freely. They weren't forced to return at any one point. You did have some of the Indians returning. And these Indians were referred to as returnees. Now, they also found themselves in a bit of a situation. Now, remember, they left a very impoverished India. Some of them left their families, some of them who were kidnapped. There was this idea around that time that if an Indian crossed the ocean that was known as the Kala Pani or the Black Waters, they would lose caste. Now, for some individuals, if they were to go back to their families and their communities, they would be shunned because of the idea of losing caste. So because of various reasons, some of these returnees who went back to India, when they got to Calcutta, so they're in India, yes, but at that point, they didn't know what to do. Because one, from Calcutta, they had to find their way back to their villages if they could, if they knew how to. Most of them who went back did not have much money, so they didn't have the wherewithal. Some of them who actually went back to their villages, they were shunned because of the idea of not of crossing the Kalapani. Some of them went back to their villages, and because of the economic and social displacement, they didn't find their villages. Sometimes entire villages, as I said, had to move, or they didn't find their families. So what could they do? A lot of them decided two things. They decided to return to the Caribbean. All right. So those who could afford it financially and had the money, many of them decided to go back to the Caribbean because at least they knew it was familiar. They knew that they could go back and maybe re-indenture themselves and so forth. In India, for them, because of the conditions, they didn't know what to do. And then for those unfortunate souls who did not even have the money to come back to the Caribbean, they stayed. So if you go to that port in Calcutta, in Calcutta, Garden Reach and so forth, around the port in Calcutta, you have these very, what we might call slums. All right. And they were referred to as floating communities. Floating because they comprised the people who were floating. They had nowhere to go. They couldn't go back to the Caribbean because they had no money. And of course, for various reasons, they could not go back to or find their villages. So these were a very displaced group of people, these floating communities. Life on the estates now, of course, life was bound by conditions of the contract. What was stipulated, yes. But on the estates, beyond what was said in the contract, these what we're going to look at, they were not said and outlined in the contract at all. Indians could not demand higher wages. They could not leave the estates without permission. If you wanted permission to leave the estate for whatever reason, you had to get written permission. And you were only allowed written permission to leave the estates twice per year. If you used up your two tickets, so to speak, you couldn't leave. So Indians were only allowed to leave twice per year. They could not live off the estates, all right, while indentured. They could not refuse assigned work. You could not say, you can't do this or you don't want to do it. Sometimes, even though, as I said before, even though the contracts did not stipulate, there would be a varying between task wages and daily wages, whichever brought more profit to the British. 9+ hour work days, as I mentioned, and there was also the employment of child labor on the plantation in a very smart way. At first, children maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, accompanying their parents, they would take the babies would go with their mothers because the mothers worked. All right, sometimes there would be the oldest immigrant maybe, and she can't work, so she would sit under a tree, and look after all the babies, and the mothers would come during time to feed them and so forth. But while these young babies would grow up, like about 4 or 5, they would start doing small tasks like picking up leaves and so on, and eventually they would graduate to what we call, the smaller gangs where they might do raking or small cutting of grass and so forth. So labor started from a very early age. There was this employment of child labor. And the contract certainly made no mention of wage cuts and stoppages. And that was something that was, it was common practice throughout the Caribbean or throughout the system of Indian indenture, not just in the Caribbean. Wage stoppages. Sometimes wages were blatantly withheld from maybe an entire estate, sometimes from an individual. The British found various ways of cutting wages, of keeping back wages. Sometimes it's 3 months on end, sometimes even as much as 6 months. And when they did pay them, they would not pay them the full amount. So if they kept back wages for 4 months, they might pay them for 2 months. And oftentimes when this happened, it would be because the Indians went on strikes and there were disturbances on estates. And wage cuts and stoppages in the Caribbean were the main causes of strikes and disturbances in certain parts like Trinidad, with the larger amounts of indentured labor, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, even Jamaica also. So this was, wages was the sore point, All right, so wage stoppages and cuts, although not part of the contract, they were, a common feature of life on the estates. And of course, the Indians on the estates, many times they occupied the same barracks that had been occupied by the former African enslaved. Sometimes there were huts constructed on the estates or right on the border of the estates so these Indians could live, but most of the times they stayed on the estates in these barrack houses. All right, of course, no privacy and so forth. Now, another main feature of estate life was, as I said, well, I have prosecution or persecution, you figure it out. The Indians were prosecuted as criminals for civil offenses. What were their biggest offenses? Refusing to work, either they were ill or when they were, oftentimes when wages were not being paid, the Indians would retaliate by feigning illness or not coming for work. So there were two ways that this was classified, this staying away from work. If it was under 7 days, it was seen as absenteeism. And if it was over 7 days, it was seen as desertion. And of course, eventually the Indian would have to come back to work, or he or she would be found. And then they would be charged as criminals for these civil offenses. All right. Other offenses, so to speak, would be disobedience on the estates, threats to either each other or to an overseer or manager, and verbal assaults. Really, for the exception of British Guyana, where there were a lot of physical assaults and strikes and violence on the estates, most pertaining to wages. But most of the times these were small, what you can call offenses, and they were prosecuted as criminals. So they would either be fined a maximum of $14.40 or so, or they would be imprisoned for a maximum of 3 months. Sometimes there'll be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Okay. Also, no mention of all of that on the contract, but the Indians faced physical abuse on the estates. All right, they were beaten, and of course, the women were abused in different ways. There was violence towards women. There was sexual abuse. There was rape of the women, sexual abuse by Indian men and also by non-Indian, the overseers and so forth. Okay. Sometimes if the Indians would stay away, if there was a particular person who would, desert for a while and then he would come back and then go back again. So, what they would do is that they would add up the days that he had deserted for, that he was absent for. And they would add on that collective amount to his indenture. So even if he had completed his formal indenture, they would tell him, okay, when you add up all the days, you stayed away for 45 days. Now you have to serve out those 45 days. Okay, so indenture would be extended. All of that was not in the contract. And I talked about the past. And another point to note is that laws change arbitrarily. Or from 1838 to 1917, there wasn't one set of laws. The laws kept changing. And of course, the Indians, they couldn't read or write. So they had to depend on word of mouth. So when they saw that a certain set of laws would obtain, and let's say they committed a petty crime with assault or threat, and thinking, well, okay, we'll be fine, then of course the penalty would have changed. So it was very confusing for them to have to handle the law. Okay, and as the laws changed, they became more and more strict or stringent. And this is just an image of Indians cutting sugarcane. You can see the way they are dressed also. It's some of them are wearing dhotis, short dhotis, of course. And the British would eventually have issues with this. They would say the Indians were dressing indecently, both men and women, because they were exposing too much. But then, you can't very well wear trousers to go and cut cane. Right. Now, theoretically, there were certain tools and measures put in place to protect the Indians, theoretically, all right? Usually, they're practically speaking, they were very ineffectual and they were very biased towards colonialism, all those planters and so forth, all right? Now, firstly, as I mentioned somewhere before, you had in each colony, there was the immigration department headed by the Protector of Immigrants. And that office and that individual was supposed to be the one who looked out for the Indians. That office was supposed to be the final court of appeal. If the Indians had a problem on the estate, whether against the manager or whoever, the immigration department or the office of the Protector of Immigrants was where they could go, all right? That office was responsible for formulating regulations specific to the Indians on the various colonies. The Protector of Immigrants was supposed to visit these estates frequently to ensure that the Indians were treated well, to ensure that the conditions on the estates were good. But these visits were actually, they just did it maybe twice a year, and they would inform the estates before they went, so that when the estates knew that a Protector of Immigrants was going to visit, they would make sure they would pretty up the estates and and fix things up and so forth, so that, the inspection would be passed. And of course, they would doctor up their wage records and so forth. So yes, on paper, you have this office and this individual and all these tools put in place, but what really happened was different from what was put on paper. All right. This office of the protector of immigrants was very frequently vulnerable to pressure from the planters. And apart from being vulnerable, they were openly biased. They were supposed to be there for the welfare of the Indians, but they more so protected that of colonial figures. Okay. And but there was some protective immigrants who actually did their jobs, and they were actually looking out, for the Indians. But then they too would, even though they are, fighting for the Indians, they too would come under pressure for the planters, and many of them would buckle. Okay. So the Indians knew, it didn't take very long. They realized that yes, there are these measures in place. There was also the magistrates' courts, specifically some of them to deal with Indian issues. But very quickly, the Indian realized that, we have these systems, yes, but really and truly they are biased. It's just, a front, telling us that we can complain. But when we complain, and the matter goes to court, most of the times the Indians would lose. The Indians did not have money to pay for legal counsel. Okay, they did not know the laws of the land. Most of them were illiterate in the language. Okay, so they knew that there were those measures, but they quickly realized that these measures didn't work for them. All right, they feared victimization, because let's say an Indian complained against the planter, and maybe the planter would be fined or whatever. The Indian has to go back to that same plantation to face that same planter. So they feared victimization when they returned. So the fear of victimization, and of course the knowledge and the suspicion that the case would usually go towards the advantage of the planter, deterred them from actually complaining. And ironically, the British used this lack of complaints to argue that the Indians had nothing to complain about. What they said is that we have all these systems and structures in place, and only one or two Indians might actually complain. So that says that the Indians are happy. They have nothing to complain about. A bit on the physical conditions on the estates now. Of course, the Indians lived in the barracks. The conditions were extremely subhuman, lack of privacy, inadequate ventilation, unsanitary, of course, especially poor drinking water supply, and of course, excuse me, lack of proper toileting facilities or latrines then. So what the Indians would do, and this is something that they were, it's a habit that they brought with them from India also. Sometimes, even though there were rudimentary latrines, whatever the conditions, in India, in the villages, sometimes the norm was to use the fields, a very remote part of the field. And in India, it worked because that part of the field was almost designated as a toileting facility. So nobody would go there afterwards to plant or to walk or whatever. But on the estates, now when the Indians used the field, the point is the colonial authorities did not designate that plot as a toilet. So then they would have to go back to that same plot to work and to pass and to walk in. So of course, nobody had shoes. So what would happen because of these very poor unsanitary conditions, and Indians would also, because of poor water supply, sometimes they would end up drinking and using water from drains to cook. Okay, very unsanitary. So diseases such as malaria, dysentery, cholera, were common. Yellow fever, smallpox outbreaks you had sometimes, but most common were hookworms. Indians were often infested with hookworms, and they were often anemic because they were walking barefooted in very unsanitary conditions on the ground and so forth. All right. In terms of health facilities, as per the contract, as per the regulations that varied, each estate was supposed to have a health facility, whether a hospital and so forth, but these were usually in very, very poor conditions. Sometimes these health facilities were so badly off that patients refused to go. And sometimes if Indians were taken to these health facilities, they would run away because of how poor the facilities were and go back on the estates. And of course, a very sad feature of the indenture system, especially before the 1880s, was high infant mortality rates because of collective conditions of poor drinking supply, water supply, unsanitary conditions, poor nutrients, and so forth. Okay. Here you have an image of, a group of Indians, what they're doing there. You will see a couple of them, they are holding two books in their hands. One of them is holding a musical instrument, a drum. And if you look to the back of the picture, you will see a small white structure. And even though there were restrictions in terms of practice of religion and culture, very early on, from let's say the 1880s or so, the Indians, especially the Hindus, started to construct these very rudimentary structures that they used as a temple. So they were not very big, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, very small. And it basically was the house and the image, maybe 1 or 2 images of their gods. So on the estates too, you saw signs of religion and culture in very small ways, being implemented. Social life on the estate, big problem, acute male-female imbalance in terms of the numbers. So of course, unstable family life, women, were in high demand. There was a lot of competition for women. It also led to violence against women, sexual abuse of women. There was breakdown of traditional systems, family, caste, community. The Indians were there to work. They were there as labor sources. So no emphasis was placed on family, caste, and community. Restrictions on cultural practices. You could not, they were said to be disturbing the peace. Hindus could not cremate. Indian marriages were not legally recognized. And because of that, inheritance was often taken back by the states because the children were seen as bastards. All right, so they could not inherit property. There was no emphasis on educating Indian children except when the Canadian Presbyterian Mission came to the Caribbean, and they did so especially in Guyana and Trinidad. But of course, conversion was also the order of the day. Here you have an image of a Muslim festival known as Muharram or Hosay, very, very spectacular. And this was constructed, these tazias, or these monuments were constructed even during the indenture period with the sparse resources. So it shows a lot of the creativity of the people. Now, I'll move quickly into the termination of the system. In 1917, the system was formally brought to an end. However, people, were already contracted and so on. So we can say when they completed their periods of contract by 1920, the system was formally ended. Okay. Reasons for indentureship was multifold, but we have to remember the main reason was the declining profitability of the system to the British. It was becoming, in their eyes, it became less and less profitable to keep bringing these Indians. Then, of course, Gandhi had taken up the situation of the indentured Indians in South Africa and was fighting against the system since then. When he went back to India, the Indian national movement, some members took up the cause of the Indians within the structure of the Indian system. And, they also argued against the system and highlighted its atrocities and so on. Even before Gandhi, however, the anti-slavery lobbyists very early on took on this issue of indentureship, and they also kept a close eye on indenture and outlined and highlighted some of the atrocities of the system and so on. There are many commissions of inquiry throughout the indentureship period that again highlighted the system and its negative impact on the people and so forth, the poor conditions. So basically you had a continued highlighting of the negativity of the system, but at the end of the day, by the time you got to 1970, the British realized that it was not as profitable as it was earlier on, and they decided, well, of course, World War I would also be a factor, small factor, but nevertheless, because they now had to concentrate their military and other resources on the World War effort. So all put together, the system was brought to an end in 1917. But remember, there were no real humanitarian reasons on the part of the British for ending the system. All right. No, they would make humanitarian arguments, but those were not the reasons. It all had to do with dollars and cents and profitability. All right. Beyond the estates, many Indians, as I said, chose to remain in the Caribbean. I'll wrap up now. They moved off from 1880s. Some of them lived close to the estates because they continued to work on the estates. Some continued living on the estates. But those who moved off, that period signified the beginning of homes and village networks and reconstruction of social, religious, and cultural institutions as they would have known it in India. Some communities, of course, over time, all communities will integrate into the larger society, but in some communities, that integration and assimilation would be quicker, like in those areas with smallest numbers of Indians, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent. Very quickly, the community was integrated into the larger society. Very quickly, Indians in some of these communities realized that the acquisition of land and education were two very key agents of social mobility. So emphasis was placed on acquiring education, formal education, and land. And this is just a picture of a typical early post-indenture village. This is a Presbyterian church. They use Indian names, Jagat Ka Prakash, to entice the Indians into the church. Contributions made by the Indians to the development of the sugarcane industry, introduction of wet rice cultivation, growth of the cocoa and coffee industries also, to agriculture and food production generally. Indians became first of all, small business owners, and then of course, large business owners. Some of them are estate owners, and you had them entering from about the 1920s, 30s into the various professions. And this is just a scene of Hindus conducting a prayers for the welfare of the society, the colony during the World War II period, an image of an Indian woman to end it off. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. I do hope that it was informative and helped throw light on, the system known as Indian indenture. Thank you.